The woman's voice split the stifling air like a blade. "Help, my lord, help!" King Jehoram stopped mid-stride atop the wall, his royal robes clinging to his gaunt frame. Below him, in the courtyard where children once played, a skeletal figure raised her hands, a supplicant before her king. But there was something wrong in her eyes, not the hollow desperation he'd grown accustomed to seeing in his starving subjects. Something else. Something that made his stomach contract with a dread deeper than hunger. "If the Lord does not help you," Jehoram heard himself say, his voice cracking, "where shall I help you? From the threshing floor, from the wine press?" Both lay empty now. Had been empty for months. The words tasted bitter as ash. "What troubles you?" he asked, though part of him, the part that still possessed sanity, didn't want to know. The woman's mouth opened. What came out would haunt the walls of Samaria forever. "This woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. But when I said to her the next day, 'Now give your son,' she has hidden him." The world tilted. Jehoram felt the coarse stone beneath his palms, grounding him as the words echoed through his skull. Boiled. My son. Ate him. The methodical horror of it. Not madness, but calculation. An agreement between mothers. A contract sealed in flesh. His hands moved of their own accord, tearing at his royal garments. The fabric ripped with a sound like screaming. And there, revealed beneath the purple, the people saw what their king had been hiding. Sackcloth. The rough garment of mourning pressed against his skin, hidden beneath the pretense of power. He had been grieving privately while his kingdom consumed itself, but this abomination, was beyond grief, beyond prayer, beyond anything his corrupted soul could process. "May God do so to me and more also," Jehoram roared, spittle flying from his cracked lips, "if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on him today." The prophet. Yes, the prophet had brought them to this, had counseled patience while children died, had spoken of the Lord's deliverance while mothers boiled their babies. Elisha would answer for this covenant of flesh with his blood. But to understand how the capital of Israel, proud Samaria, fortress of the Omri dynasty, descended to such depths, we must turn back. Back to when the horizon first darkened with the army of Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. Back to when death still seemed like something that happened to other people. It began as a shadow spreading across the valleys, not the shadow of clouds, but of men, thousands upon thousands, stretching from the eastern hills to the western ridges. Ben-Hadad, son of Hadad, had brought his full might against Samaria. 32 kings rode in his coalition, their banners a forest of colored death surrounding the city. The sound of their camp was a continuous roar, fires crackling, horses whinnying, metal on metal as weapons were sharpened for the siege. Inside Samaria's walls, the people watched from the heights. The city sat atop a steep hill, its casemate fortifications built of massive ashlar blocks that had withstood sieges before. Palace elevated above peasant, noble above merchant, all arranged in tiers up the slopes, like an amphitheater preparing for the grandest tragedy ever staged. King Jehoram stood in his father Ahab's palace, staring at ivory decorations that had cost more than most of his subjects earned in a lifetime. 500 carved pieces adorned these walls, testaments to prosperity now ringing hollow as the encirclement tightened. His mother Jezebel's influence lingered in every corner, the Phoenician excess that had drawn prophetic condemnation for decades. But Elisha was here in the city. That had to count for something. "How long can we hold?" Jehoram asked his chamberlain. "The cisterns are full, my lord. Food stores, 3 months. Perhaps 4 if rationed." 3 months. 4 at most. And Ben-Hadad's army showed no signs of leaving. They were building siege works digging in. This wouldn't be a quick assault. This would be starvation. The first week passed with relative normalcy. Markets still functioned, though prices climbed. The second week brought the first signs of panic. Wealthy families hoarding, bribes paid for extra rations. By the third week, the gates saw their first violence as hungry crowds fought over diminishing supplies. "A sea of wheat for 5 shekels, a merchant announced, his voice uncertain. The price had tripled. "Highway robbery," someone shouted. But they paid. Everyone paid. By the 6th week, the wheat was gone. Barley replaced it at prices that would have been unconscionable before. The poor began eating things that made the wealthy avert their eyes, weeds from between paving stones, leather cut from old sandals and boiled until soft, mice caught in traps, originally meant for grain storage. Jehoram walked the walls daily, showing himself to his people, reassuring them with his presence, but beneath his robes he had begun wearing sackcloth, private penance for public sins. His father had murdered Naboth for a vineyard. His mother had slaughtered the prophets of the Lord. His brother Ahaziah had fallen through a lattice and died calling on foreign gods. The house of Ahab was cursed, and now the curse was devouring Samaria one empty stomach at a time. "The Lord will provide," Elisha had told him during one tense council meeting. The prophet sat calm and unmoved while advisers argued strategy. "When?" Jehoram had demanded. "When will he provide? The people are eating dung from dovecotes." "The Lord's timing is not yours to question," Elisha replied, his weathered face impassive. "Wait on him." Wait. Easy for a prophet to say. Prophets didn't have to listen to the wails of starving children echoing off stone walls at night. By the 10th week, the city had transformed into something unrecognizable. Streets that once bustled with commerce lay empty, except for the skeletal forms of those too weak to seek shelter. The smell of death, the sweet, putrid stench of bodies left unburied, merged with smoke from fires burning inside houses where families had retreated behind barred doors. Trust had died, along with mercy. 80 shekels for a donkey's head. The price echoed through the market square, a fortune for what was essentially bone and gristle. 2 pounds of silver for something people would have fed to dogs months ago. But in the arithmetic of starvation, even a donkey's head represented precious protein. The brain could be scooped out. The jaw meat, stringy and foul, could be chewed until soft. Someone was selling dove's dung, or perhaps seed pods that looked like droppings. For 5 shekels per quarter cab, less than a handful, people bought it with trembling hands, their eyes vacant as the dead. Jehoram saw a child's corpse being carried through the street, wrapped in cloth too fine for the family that bore it. They'd sold everything else for food. The burial shroud was their last possession. The father's face was stone, past grief, past hope, existing in some grey place between death and consciousness. "How long?" Jehoram whispered to the sky. But the sky remained indifferent, blue and beautiful, mocking the horror below with its serenity. The two women had been neighbors once, before the siege, before starvation stripped away the pretense of civilization. They'd borrowed oil from one another, watched each other's children, shared gossip while grinding grain that now existed only in memory. The first woman, her name is lost to history, consumed by the horror of her act, held a son perhaps 3 years old, still nursing, still round-cheeked despite the famine. How had she managed that? What had she sacrificed to keep him fed while the city hollowed out around them? The second woman also had a son, older, maybe 5, old enough to understand hunger, old enough to cry for food that didn't come. Neither husband survived to witness what came next. One fell to disease in the 7th week. The other simply didn't wake one morning, his body having consumed itself from the inside out. The women buried them in shallow graves in the courtyard, unable to carry them to proper tombs outside the walls. "We're going to die," the first woman said one night. They'd begun sheltering together, pooling their resources, which meant sharing their desperation. "All of us. The children, too." "I know." The second woman's voice was flat. She'd progressed beyond tears. "There's no food left, nothing. I've eaten the paste we used for lamps. I've chewed leather until my gums bled. There's nothing." Silence stretched between them, heavy as the darkness filling their shared hovel. Outside, someone was screaming. The sound had become so common it barely registered. "Unless—" The first woman's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might judge what she was about to propose. "My son. Tomorrow. We could. And then the next day, yours." The second woman should have recoiled, should have struck her neighbor, driven her into the street, called for guards. But hunger has a voice louder than morality, and that voice had been screaming in both their heads for weeks. Survival, live, eat, whatever it takes. Tomorrow, the second woman heard herself ask. You would. It's better than watching them die slowly. This way we survive, one of us at least. One of us, at... The logic was poison dressed as mercy. But in that moment, in that darkness, with starvation's claws tearing at their insides, it sounded almost reasonable. Tomorrow, the second woman agreed. And then the next day, mine. They didn't shake hands, didn't swear oaths. The agreement existed in the silence between breaths, in the shared damnation of their decision. Two mothers, reduced to something less than human, more than animal, something uniquely terrible that only desperation could create. The first woman spent that night holding her son. He whimpered in her arms, hungry, always hungry, his small body nothing but skin stretched over bones. She'd given him everything, sacrificed everything. This would be the final sacrifice, the complete one. Forgive me, she whispered into his soft hair, but she couldn't say whether she was asking forgiveness from him, from God, or from the person she used to be. Morning came with its cruel light. The second woman arrived at first light, her face carefully blank. They didn't speak. Speaking would make it real in a way silence kept at arm's length. The first woman handed over her son. The child reached for his mother one last time, confused, trusting. She turned away. Water was precious, but they used some. Built a small fire, dangerous when fuel was scarce, but necessary. The pot they used had once held stew, lentils and onions, in another lifetime. Now it held something else, something they couldn't name without losing what remained of their sanity. They ate. Survival demanded it. The taste was irrelevant. They'd lost the capacity to taste weeks ago. It was flesh, it was protein. It was life continuing at the cost of life ended. Mothers consuming son. The circle closed into something worse than hell. The first woman felt nothing. That was worse somehow than grief would have been. She'd passed beyond the threshold where emotions functioned. There was only the mechanical necessity of chewing, swallowing, existing one more day. Night fell. The second woman retreated to her section of the hovel where her son slept unaware. Tomorrow. Tomorrow would be her turn to fulfill the covenant. Equal sacrifice, shared horror, fair. But fairness died with civilization. When morning came, the second woman's door was barred from inside. You promised! The first woman's voice cracked like breaking bones. You made a covenant, your son, you swore. I can't. The voice from within was tiny, ashamed, but firm. I can't do it. I can't. You made me... The words strangled in her throat. You made me give my son your turn, your turn. But the door remained closed. The covenant was broken. One woman had surrendered everything while the other had surrendered nothing. The mathematics of horror had failed. The first woman wandered into the street, her mind fracturing. She'd consumed her son for nothing. The survival she'd purchased with his flesh extended only to herself. The second woman would somehow continue, protected by her cowardice, her son alive, while hers was not. Injustice burned hotter than hunger. She found herself at the base of the wall, staring up at where King Jehoram made his daily rounds. The king who promised protection, who swore the Lord would deliver them, who'd let this happen while wearing sackcloth under his royal robes, grief as theatre, performance of piety without power. The woman opened her mouth and screamed for justice, for judgment, for anything. Help, my lord, help! The king's robes hung in tatters from where he'd torn them. His chest heaved, sackcloth exposed to every eye. The people stared. Their king had been mourning all along, pretending normalcy while wearing his grief next to his skin. Hypocrite or fellow sufferer? They couldn't decide. But Jehoram's mind had fixated on a single thought, sharp as a blade. Elisha. The prophet had been in the city this entire time, speaking of the Lord's will, the Lord's timing, the Lord's plan. And to what end? Mothers eating children, the price of a donkey's skull equal to a laborer's yearly wage, 5 shekels for literal shit. Elisha brought us here, Jehoram said, his voice low and deadly. He told me to show mercy to the Arameans when we had them trapped. Feed them, he said. Send them home in peace, the Lord commands it, and I listened. His chamberlain shifted nervously. The king was building to something dangerous. Those same Arameans are out there. Jehoram pointed at the walls, at the siege beyond. The ones we fed, the ones we freed, they've come back to starve us because of that prophet. Because I listened to that meddling, murderous... The title stuck in his throat. Son of a murderer, just like Jehoram himself, child of Ahab who'd killed Naboth for his vineyard. Blood calling to blood. Curse recognizing curse. May God do so to me and more also, Jehoram swore, the oath formula cutting sharp. If the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on him today, he dispatched a messenger, or perhaps he followed himself, the text is unclear, toward the prophet's dwelling, rage propelling him where despair had paralyzed. Finally, action. Finally, something he could cut. Elisha sat in his house with the city elders, discussing scripture or prophecy or whatever prophets discussed, while kingdoms collapsed. He looked up suddenly, his eyes distant. "Do you see how this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head?" The elders glanced at each other, confused. No messenger had arrived. "When the messenger comes, shut the door. Hold it shut against him. The sound of his master's feet follows behind." Prophetic knowledge, infuriating and perfect. The door barred just as footsteps thundered outside. A fist pounded stone, voices raised in command. But Elisha simply waited, calm as still water. The door shuddered but held. Then the king's voice, raw with anguish. "This evil is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Truth and despair married in that statement. Yes, this was judgment from the Lord, fulfillment of covenant curses spelled out in Deuteronomy. Siege, famine, and worse. You will eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters. Moses had prophesied this horror centuries ago as consequence for turning from God. And Israel had turned. Again and again, Baal worship and high places, and the abominations Jezebel brought from Phoenicia. So yes, this evil came from the Lord. But Jehoram's conclusion, to stop waiting on God, was itself the ultimate apostasy, acknowledging God's sovereignty while rejecting his authority, believing enough to blame, not enough to trust. "Hear the word of the Lord," Elisha's voice rang out, clear and cold. "Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a sea of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, at the gate of Samaria." Silence. The proclamation hung in the air like smoke. From starvation to abundance in 24 hours. Impossible. The royal officer, the one who stood at the king's right hand, who leaned on the king's arm in council, laughed. Not with joy, but with hysteria barely restrained. "Look," he said, voice dripping with scorn, "if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be?" Windows in heaven, a reference to the flood, when God opened the heavens and drowned the world. The officer was saying even that, even divine cataclysm couldn't reverse this famine. Food didn't fall from the sky. Armies didn't vanish overnight. Reality had rules, and prophecy was delusion. Elisha's eyes fixed on him. "You shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." A double prophecy, deliverance and judgment in the same breath. The city would be saved. This man would not be. 4 lepers sat at the gate entrance, outside the walls where ritual purity laws required them to remain. They'd been there for years, social outcasts dependent on charity that had dried up weeks ago. Now they existed in a peculiar limbo, too unclean to enter the city, too weak to go anywhere else. "Why are we sitting here waiting to die?" one asked. "His name is lost. All their names are lost. They're remembered only as 4 lepers, as if disease was their entire identity. If we say we'll go into the city, famine is there," another responded. "We die. If we sit here, we die," a third added. "So let's go to the Aramean camp," the fourth concluded. "If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we just die, same as staying." Logic of the desperate. Option 3 at least held possibility. 1 and 2 were merely choosing how to starve. Twilight gathered as they stood, joints protesting, skin painful, where sores had opened and opened again over years. They approached the camp not as spies but as beggars, hands empty, postures defeated, prepared to throw themselves on enemy mercy because their own people had none to give. The camp was silent, not the silence of sleep or rest, the silence of absence. No sentries challenged them, no sounds of soldiers talking, laughing, preparing evening meals, just the whisper of wind through empty tents and the nervous pawing of horses left tied to stakes. The lepers exchanged glances, walked further, still nothing. The Aramean camp stretched in every direction, hundreds, thousands of tents, all empty, all abandoned. "What happened?" one whispered. They entered the nearest tent. Inside, food, not scraps or rations, but abundance, bread, dried meat, wine in skins. They fell on it like animals, weeks of starvation overriding every other instinct. Chewed without tasting, swallowed without breathing, consumed without thought. When the immediate desperation passed, they looked around with clearer eyes. Not just food, silver, gold, fine garments, the complete supplies of a siege army that planned to be here for months, all abandoned. "Take it," one said. They gathered treasures, carrying armfuls to hiding spots outside the camp, returned for more. This time a different tent, same abundance, same inexplicable absence. They did this 3 times, 4, hiding wealth they couldn't have imagined accumulating in 10 lifetimes. But as they prepared for a 5th run, one stopped. "We're not doing right." The others turned. "What?" "This is a day of good news. We're being silent. If we wait until morning, punishment will overtake us. We should tell the king's household." Punishment. Divine punishment for hoarding blessing. Even lepers, ritually unclean and socially dead, recognized obligation. They'd been given the first taste of deliverance, not despite their status, but perhaps because of it. The lowest discovering what the highest had lost, the outcast becoming evangelists of salvation. They returned to the city gate, calling up to the gatekeepers. "We went to the Aramean camp. No one's there, no voice of man, only horses tied and donkeys tied and tents just as they were." The gatekeepers relayed the message to the palace. King Jehoram roused from whatever dark contemplation had occupied him since his confrontation with Elisha. "It's a trap," he said immediately. "They know we're starving. They've left the camp to hide in the fields. When we leave the city, they'll catch us alive and enter Samaria." Paranoia born from trauma. He couldn't conceive of genuine deliverance, only deeper levels of manipulation and betrayal. But a servant counseled wisdom. "Let some men take 5 of the horses that remain. They're as good as dead anyway. Like all the multitude of Israel who've perished, send them to sea." So scouts rode out into darkness, following the road the Aramean army had taken in retreat. The path told its story. Garments thrown aside, equipment abandoned, supplies jettisoned. Not the orderly withdrawal of a strategic repositioning. The panicked flight of an army running for its life. The scouts followed the trail all the way to the Jordan, 25 miles of discarded wealth and terror. They returned as dawn broke, reporting to a king who could barely process what he was hearing. For the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and horses, the sound of a great army. The explanation would come later, after witnesses pieced together what they could from Aramean deserters caught fleeing east. Ben-Hadad's coalition had been settling in for the long siege when, in twilight, they heard it. The thunder of chariots, the pounding of thousands of hooves, the unmistakable sound of a massive army approaching. "The king of Israel has hired the Hittites and Egyptians against us," commanders shouted. It made perfect sense. A desperate Israel calling in debts from empires to the north and south. A coalition to break a coalition, standard geopolitical strategy, except no such alliance existed. No Hittite chariots rode south. No Egyptian armies marched north. There was only sound, divine acoustic terror projected into their ears, or perhaps amplified from the shuffling feet of 4 lepers approaching in the darkness. God needed no physical army. He needed only the perception of one. Panic rippled through the camp like fire through dead grass. Soldiers abandoned posts. Officers forgot discipline. The entire siege force dissolved into terrified individuals fleeing for their lives, dropping everything that might slow their retreat. By the time the lepers arrived, the Aramean army was miles away, running through the night toward the Jordan, toward Damascus, toward anywhere that wasn't within reach of the phantom armies their ears had conjured. As dawn broke over Samaria, word spread through the starving city. The siege was ended, the camp abandoned. Food was there, mountains of food, free for the taking. The gates opened. The people surged forward, no longer human but a wave of desperation given form. They poured toward the Aramean camp, like water through a broken dam, trampling anyone too slow, too weak, too hesitant. At the gate, the king had stationed the royal officer, the one who'd mocked Elisha's prophecy, to maintain order and oversee distribution. He stood in the bottleneck where the pressing crowd converged, trying to direct the flow, shouting commands that no one heard over the roar of salvation-starved voices. The crowd pushed. He stumbled. Someone's elbow struck his chest. Someone else's foot came down on his hand. He fell. And then the press of bodies became irresistible, a human avalanche that saw an obstacle and flowed over it, around it, through it. By the time the surge passed, the officer lay broken in the gateway, ribs crushed, skull fractured, eyes open and fixed on the sky that had no windows. He saw it with his eyes but did not eat of it, prophecy fulfilled with precise, terrible accuracy. At the Aramean camp, people wept while they ate, gorged themselves sick on food their stomachs couldn't process after weeks of starvation, fought over spoils, stuffed bags and carts with supplies, and yes, in the marketplace that spontaneously organized at the gate, prices fell to exactly what Elisha had predicted. A sea of fine flour for a shekel, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel. Food returned from death scarcity to life abundance in the span of a single day. The king walked through the chaos, past the officer's corpse, into the camp, where his people celebrated deliverance they couldn't understand. He'd torn his robes, exposed his private mourning, condemned the prophet, and witnessed the fulfillment of prophecy anyway. God moved according to his own timeline, responsive to nothing but his own purposes. Jehoram found Elisha standing at the edge of the camp, watching the people reclaim their future. The prophet's face was unreadable. "You knew," Jehoram said. Not an accusation, just fact. "The Lord knows," Elisha replied. "I only speak what I'm given. The woman who came to me, the one who—" Jehoram couldn't finish. The horror was too fresh. "Covenant curses fulfilled," Elisha said quietly. "Moses warned your ancestors. Deuteronomy chapter 28. You shall eat the fruit of your own womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters." This was always the consequence of turning from God. And the deliverance, why now? Why not yesterday before she— Would you have believed yesterday? Elisha turned to face him. "If I'd prophesied deliverance before you reached the bottom of despair, would you have waited? Would you have trusted? Sometimes the darkness must be complete before we recognize light. That's monstrous." "That's mercy," Elisha corrected. "You think this was punishment? It was warning. God showed you the end of the path you're walking. Your father murdered. Your mother slaughtered prophets. Your house has made covenant with Baal and broken covenant with the Lord. This," he gestured at the camp, the celebrating people, "is the last grace. The final call to repentance before judgment becomes permanent." Jehoram looked at his torn robes, the sackcloth underneath. "I've been repenting." "You've been performing repentance," Elisha said, "wearing mourning clothes under your robes like a secret. Your father Ahab did the same, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth when Elijah condemned him, and God granted him mercy. But his heart never changed, neither has yours." "How do you know my heart?" "The same way I knew you were coming to kill me. The same way I knew deliverance would come today. The same way I knew the officer would die in the gate." Elisha's voice softened slightly. "The question isn't whether God knows your heart, it's whether you do." The king had no answer. He turned and walked back toward the city, stepping over the officer's body without looking down. Behind him, people continued flooding toward abundance, the taste of salvation on their tongues, the memory of horror just beginning to fade. The city celebrated for days. Food returned, commerce re-established, bodies buried, those who died in the famine, those trampled in the rush for deliverance. Life attempting to resume its normal patterns, like water filling a dry stream bed. But normalcy was illusion. The woman who'd come before the king was never seen again. Perhaps she fled to another city, carrying her horror with her. Perhaps she took her own life, unable to live with what she'd done. The second woman, the one who broke their covenant, also vanished from record. Their children, one dead, one alive, disappeared into history's silence. The king returned to his palace, to his ivory walls and elevated perch above the city. He kept wearing sackcloth under his robes, private penance for public sins. But he changed nothing. The high places remained. Baal worship continued. The house of Ahab marched toward its appointed end. Jehu's bloody purge would come within a decade, wiping out the entire dynasty in a single day of massacre. Elisha continued his ministry, prophet to the end, speaking uncomfortable truths to kings who rarely listened. He would outlive Jehoram, outlive Jehu, outlive entire generations. His bones would work miracles even after death. A corpse thrown into his tomb would revive upon touching his remains, power that persisted beyond the grave. The 4 lepers returned to their posts outside the gate. They were wealthy now. The treasures they'd hidden would keep them comfortable for life. But they remained lepers, still unclean, still outcast, still barred from entering the city they'd helped save. They'd been chosen as first witnesses, not despite their status, but because of it. God's pattern, using the despised, the broken, the cast out, to shame the powerful and holy. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, retreated to Damascus and never besieged Samaria again. Within a few years, Hazael would murder him and seize the throne, beginning a new cycle of conflict with Israel. The siege would be remembered, in Samaria as the time of deliverance, in Damascus as the night the gods went mad, and armies heard what wasn't there. But the deepest mark the siege left was invisible. Every mother in Samaria now knew what she was capable of when pushed beyond the edge of humanity. Every man understood how quickly civilization's veneer could strip away, revealing the savage beneath. Every child who survived grew up knowing that adults, parents, kings, prophets couldn't guarantee protection against the darkness. The covenant of flesh was broken, but its memory endured, written in scripture as warning, preserved as testimony to how far humans could fall and how mysteriously God could deliver. Judgment and salvation intertwined so completely they became indistinguishable, 2 faces of the same terrible, holy truth. Samaria would fall eventually, not to Ben-Hadad, but to Assyria decades later, in a siege that made this one look like rehearsal. The 10 northern tribes would be scattered, lost to history, never to return. Israel's kingdom would end in exile and confusion, absorbed into empires that worshipped different gods and spoke different tongues. But that ending was still future when this siege ended. For now, in the aftermath of horror and deliverance, the people of Samaria had a choice. Would they learn? Would they turn from the patterns that led to cannibalism and covenant curses? Would they recognize that supernatural deliverance was also supernatural warning? The Book of Kings records their answer in the kings that followed, the apostasy that continued, the judgments that accumulated until the final one arrived with Assyrian armies and permanent deportation. They saw the windows of heaven open, not with water like the flood, but with deliverance as mysterious and absolute. They tasted salvation purchased not by their righteousness, but by God's mercy. And they went back to their idols. That perhaps is the darkest horror of all. Not the cannibalism born from desperate hunger, not the mother who boiled her son, not even the broken covenant between neighbors. The true horror was the hardness of heart that could witness a miracle and return unchanged to the very sins that summoned judgment in the first place. The siege of Samaria stands as monument and warning. Here is what we become when we forget who we are. Here is the depth to which we fall when we sever covenant with the divine. Here is the darkness we embrace when we trust ourselves more than God. And here, finally, is the inexplicable mercy that delivers us anyway, not because we deserve it, but because that's the nature of the God we've abandoned. The woman's voice still echoes from those ancient walls if you listen. We boiled my son and ate him. 3,000 years later, the horror has not diminished. The warning remains fresh, and the question persists. What covenant are we making in our own desperation? What are we willing to consume to survive? And when deliverance comes, as it always does in God's timing, will we recognize it for what it is? The judgment and the mercy, the horror and the salvation, the curse fulfilled and the prophecy vindicated, all bound together in those terrible holy days when Samaria ate itself and God opened heaven without windows. sending deliverance not from above, but from within the darkness itself. 4 lepers stumbling into abandoned camps, discovering that salvation had been waiting all along, hidden just beyond the threshold of despair. This is the story. This is the warning. This is the covenant, written in flesh and blood and divine mercy, that refuses to relent even when we deserve nothing but the consequences we've earned. Remember it. Remember what happens when kingdoms turn from God. Remember that judgment is real, but so is deliverance. Remember that the lowest may become first witnesses of salvation, while the highest fall in the very gateway to abundance. And remember most of all that the question isn't whether God will act, but whether we'll recognize his action when it comes, hidden in ways we never expected, arriving at moments we didn't predict, using instruments we would never choose. The head of Elisha remained on his shoulders. The officer died seeing what he couldn't taste. The mothers learned what they were capable of becoming. And the city was saved despite itself, a type and shadow of the greater deliverance that would come centuries later, when another covenant would be sealed, not in the flesh of sons boiled for survival, but in the flesh of a son given for redemption. Samaria's siege ended, the story continues, the warning stands, and the question remains, what are we willing to eat to survive? And what are we willing to sacrifice for deliverance? May we never have to choose, and if we must, may we choose rightly. But most of all, may we recognize that the choice was never ours to make alone, that hovering over every siege, every famine, every desperate covenant between neighbors, there stands a God who judges and delivers in ways we cannot predict or control, according to purposes we rarely understand but desperately need. This is the horror at Samaria's gate. This is the warning written in covenant curses. This is the judgment that is also mercy, the darkness that precedes dawn, the death that makes room for life. Remember it, for it was preserved not to entertain but to warn, not to shock but to transform, not to condemn but to call us back from the edge of whatever abyss we're approaching, before we too make covenants we cannot keep and consume what should be protected. The voice still echoes, "Help, my Lord, help!" And the answer still comes, "Tomorrow, about this time." Between the cry and the answer lies all human history, desperate, broken, blessed, judged, delivered, and called to choose again what kind of people we will become when the siege surrounds us, and the food runs out, and the only thing left to consume is our own humanity. Choose wisely. The covenant you make in darkness may be the one you're judged by in light.